Welcome to your psychology video notes. Today we are building on previous lectures related to biological development. This video lecture summarizes attachment as the foundation for further psychosocial development across the lifespan. We begin with John Bowlby's research on attachment. Infants construct an enduring affectional tie or bond called attachment to their primary caregiver. The kind and quality of this attachment depends upon sensitive, responsive care. Attachment is the foundation for meeting basic psychological, social, and personality development. The importance of the child-adult attachment in infancy has far-reaching consequences for families and communities, such as to attain an individual's full intellectual potential, to sort out perceptions, to think logically, to develop a conscience, to become self-reliant and cope with stress and frustration, to handle fear and worry, and to reduce jealousy and maintain self-esteem, and to be affectionate towards others. Fathers tend to interact with their children in a physical way that children enjoy and has long-term developmental benefits for children. Fathers do attachment differently, not wrong. While variation in attachment style is thought to reflect caregiver behavior, a caregiver's behavior is sometimes a response to the infant's own natural temperament. Because a child's temperament interacts with the quality of attachment to caregivers, children who show high levels of negative affect early in life are more likely to be insecurely attached as toddlers. These children may elicit less warm and less responsive behavior from caregivers, who instead pull away under stress. Unfortunately, this may lead to a cycle in which insecure attachment style leads to even more distress for both child and caregivers. Psychologists measure attachment with a technique called the strange situation, developed by Mary Ainsworth and intended for children between 1 and 2 years of age, where the primary caregiver brings a toddler to a playroom that she or he has never been to before, and the caregiver remains in the room for a short time, not interacting with the child, where the psychologist looks on through a two-way mirror. The psychologist notes whether the child clings to the parent or explores the toys. If the child explores, does he or she wander out of sight of the caregiver or keep the caregiver in his or her line of sight? Then the caregiver leaves the playroom. Does the child cry? Or does the child seem unconcerned about the parents leaving, or attempt to console him or herself by rocking or thumb-sucking? The last step of the strange situation is that the caregiver returns. The psychologist notes whether the child is happy to greet the caregiver, angry at the caregiver, or pretends not to notice that the caregiver has returned. Categories of attachment are secure attachment. 65% of children are securely attached. Here, the child uses the caregiver as a secure base, with a strong preference for the caregiver over strangers, and actively seeks contact on the caregiver's return. An avoidant attachment is about 20% of children. Here, the child is unresponsive to the caregiver, not distressed when the caregiver leaves, avoids, or slow to greet the caregiver upon return. With resistant attachment, about 10 to 15% of children, the child clings to the caregiver, fails to explore, and on the caregiver's return is angry, sometimes hitting, and fails to be comforted. Anxious, ambivalent, sometimes called disorganized or disoriented attachment, is about 5 to 10% of children. These children appear confused with contradictory behaviors, flat, depressed affect, odd, frozen postures, high apprehension, and have the greatest insecurity. Bowlby proposed that all infants attach to their caregivers, usually the parents, in infancy. However, the specific attachment behaviors shown by an infant can vary depending on the social environment. When the caregiver is attentive and responsive to the infant's cues, the child is likely to show a secure attachment style, exploring the environment playfully when the caregiver is present, and crying when the caregiver leaves, but comforted by the caregiver, but not by others, when the caregiver returns. When a caregiver is not responsive to an infant's cues, the child is likely to show anxious attachment and be hesitant to explore even when the caregiver is present, or clingy and indiscriminately comforted by others. When a caregiver is inattentive and unresponsive, a child is likely to show avoidant attachment, keeping track of the caregiver's location but not seeking contact or showing distress when a parent leaves. Although avoidant behavior looks like the child is not distressed by the parent's absence, physiological signs indicate intense stress. Do you shut down during an argument? Does your partner devalue you, jokingly or otherwise? Do you feel your partner keeps you at a distance, emotionally, physically, or both? Do you feel that you love your partner more than he or she loves you? This information is from a Wall Street Journal article by Elizabeth Bernstein. It shows how attachment in early childhood predicts the kinds of relationships we seek out, prefer, develop, and maintain in adulthood, secure, anxious, or avoidant. Attachment varies by culture, as different cultures have differing parenting practices. In the United States, about two-thirds of infants are classified as securely attached, with less than 20% anxious and 20% avoidant. These proportions are somewhat different in other cultures, with different norms and expectations for infant care. In Germany, where parents encourage infants to become independent earlier, avoidant behavior is more common than in the U.S. In Japan, where preschool children are rarely separated from their parents, so here the strange situation is especially strange. Anxious attachment behavior is more common. Variations in attachment behavior may have different implications in other cultures than the U.S. Research on deprivation and attachment include the cases of Jeannie, Anna, and Isabel. Each child was found at 5 or older in nearly total isolation with little social or other stimulation. Each child suffered long-term deficits in language, relationships, and some physical abilities. Studies of orphanages indicate that despite physical needs being met, infants die at higher rates. Those that survive suffer developmental delays and emotional and intellectual deficits. For many decades, researchers assumed that children bond emotionally to parents because the parents feed them and provide other material rewards. Although Harry Harlow has been criticized for his research methods, his aim was to show that emotional nurturance is vital to healthy development. In a classic study, Harlow raised baby monkeys in isolation, allowing them to spend time with two artificial mothers. One was made of wire but held a bottle of food. The other was wrapped in a fuzzy terry cloth towel. Baby monkeys choose to spend the majority of their time with the cuddlier towel, even clinging to this while reaching over to the other figure for food. Harlow concluded that infant attachment to their caregivers is based primarily on contact comfort. rather than food. Sumi, who was a student of Harlow, showed that the offspring of monkeys reared in isolation can be successfully rehabilitated, and sometimes other young monkeys are therapeutic. But remember, the rehabilitated monkeys were never reared in isolation. They were the children of parents reared in isolation, and those monkeys were unable to rear their own children. Deprivation is the lack of a rich, varied stimulation. Deprivation is the lack of rich, varied stimulation of normal homes. Warm and responsive caregiving that attends to infants' unique needs with appropriate stimulation of the senses. Early experience of deprivation leads to retarded motor development, immature play, fearfulness of new situations that are opportunities for exploration. Early experiences combine with current conditions of the child and family to affect the child's development. In this way, recovery from a deprived early environment can occur if rearing conditions improve, but may not be complete. Factors that shield resilient children from deprivation and adversity include the personal characteristics of children, such as a calm, easygoing disposition or having a special skill or talent. If a child has a social support network, such as a warm relationship with a sibling or having any special friendship outside of the immediate family. In research to identify consequences of enriched versus deprived environments, half of a litter of baby rats were taken from their mother and placed in isolated, dark, empty cages with adequate nutrition. The remaining rat babies were placed in enriched rat cages with the presence of the mother constantly licking the babies. These studies have found that enriched environments cause enhanced functioning and development in cognitive capacity, learning, memory, and resilience. The results of an enriched environment include more neurons, longer dendrites, more connections, heavier brains, greater brain mass, more connectivity, and enlarged capillaries. Enriched brains are contrasted with the deprived group who have functional deficits that can be measured in many ways. Erich Hamburger Erikson lived and worked in the 1900s and expanded upon Freud's psychosexual stage theory that we will review when we study theories of personality. You can see how the first several stages cover what we have already learned about attachment. Stage 1, basic trust versus mistrust, encompasses birth to a year-old with a focus on feeding. Developing trust is the first task and it is never complete. When the parents are consistently nurturing, the child develops trust and realizes that people are dependable. The child feels safe and secure with this sense of hope and confidence. When caregivers are inconsistent or emotionally unavailable, the child develops mistrust, resulting in depression, anxiety, and withdrawal from a world perceived as unpredictable and frightening. Each stage is more likely to have a positive outcome if the previous stage has a positive outcome. Thankfully, this developmental theory is forgiving. One may have a negative outcome, such as mistrust in stage 1, and through changes in relationships and caregiving, have a positive outcome in the following stage. In this case, stage 2, autonomy versus shame and doubt, between ages 1 and 3, with a focus on toilet training. If parents guide children gradually and firmly, praise and accept attempts to be independent, autonomy develops with personal control gained, which helps to build self-esteem. If parents are too permissive, harsh, or too demanding, the child can feel defeated and experience shame and doubt and feel inadequate. A child who emerges from stage 2 doubting their abilities and feeling shame about him or herself will have a more difficult time in stage 3, initiative versus guilt, the stage that concerns preschool children from age 3 to 5. when the child models adults. Initiative adds to autonomy the quality of undertaking and planning a task. If parents are supportive of a child's efforts, the child develops purpose and acts in ways to set and reach goals. When children are punished for attempts to show initiative, they feel guilt and self-doubt and lack initiative, which results in avoiding trying anything. Stage 4, industry versus inferiority, builds upon the initiative stage and concerns school-aged children from 5 to 12. To bring a productive situation to completion must become more valued than play. The child compares him or herself to others in all things, and if a child believes she or he cannot measure up, a child will pull back and become more isolated. In this way, a child can become a conformist whom others exploit. If adults support the child's efforts, a sense of competence develops with pride in accomplishments. Encouragement from parents and teachers is necessary for successful development through each stage. If caretakers do not support the child, feelings of inferiority develop with inertia and the helplessness of underachievement. Identity versus role confusion is from 12 to 19 and known as adolescence. This stresses the attempt to develop identity with knowledge of individual strengths, weaknesses, goals, occupational interests, sexual identity, and gender roles. Teens try on different identities, perhaps going through an identity crisis. Adolescents must focus on exploring identity being separate from their families. The following stage of early adulthood is known as intimacy versus isolation and concerns those 20 through 29, focusing on the development of healthy love relationships. Intimacy is the ability to be close, loving, and vulnerable with others. Identity versus role confusion is from 12 to 19 and known as adolescence. This stresses the attempt to develop identity with knowledge of individual strengths, weaknesses, goals, occupational interests, sexual identity, and gender roles. Teens try on different identities, perhaps going through an identity crisis. Adolescents must focus on exploring identities separate from their families. The following stage of early adulthood is known as intimacy versus isolation and concerns those 20 through 29, focusing on the development of healthy love relationships. Intimacy is the ability to be close, loving, and vulnerable with others. Intimacy is based in part upon identity development because you have to know yourself to share yourself. Failure to develop intimacy can lead to promiscuity, getting too close, too quick, and not sustaining relationships, or rejecting relationships altogether. Those with less committed relationships experience emotional isolation, depression, and loneliness. In middle adulthood, from age 30 through early 60s, is the age of generativity versus stagnation, with a focus on caring for family and productive work. One must create balance between family and work over these years to develop generativity, a sense of concern for community and the next generation without expectations of a specific return. Adults that do not feel that they can contribute develop a sense of stagnation. They're self-absorbed and feel little connection to others. They feel unproductive and uninvolved in the world. The final stage of ego integrity versus despair from age 65 through death is a time called late adulthood or old age. This is the time for reflecting back upon one's life and choices, accepting successes and failures, accepting aging and loss, and this entails facing the ending of life. Those who develop ego integrity and accept their lives develop a sense of wisdom. Wisdom undermines regrets, bitterness, despair, and a feeling that your life has been wasted, as well as a dread of death.